I think it draws our attention to something that is fascinating and incredibly culturally productive about Christianity, which is that it's not monocultural. So
Mm.
the Christian Bible, Old and New Testament,
Mm-hmm.
is not written in one
Mm-hmm.
language. I don't think we make enough of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea that God can adequately communicate himself in more than one linguistic mode is just overflowing with cultural implications. So the Bible doesn't bring a monoculture with it. To become a Christian, you don't have to conform to one particular worldly cultural type. Now, there are certain things that you will want to do and certain habits that you want to keep as a Christian, but it's not, for example, to take a very crude thing, Christianity isn't Western.
Right.
You don't have to become Western to become a Christian. You don't have to become anything in terms of geographical or temporal culture to become a Christian. And this is reflected in the fact that the Bible is multilingual. God is not constricted to one language. He's not constricted to one culture. You've got in the Bible, there are nomadic cultural expressions of following God. There's monarchy. There's living under occupation. All of these are legitimate contexts in which to be followers of God. And so the Bible is culturally diverse, it's linguistically diverse. And therefore, I think that Christians are in a very productive position to be culturally um, open uh, from that point of view. And not to say that becoming a Christian is conforming to any one particular culture any more than making Christian art is making it in one style. Let me come on to this antithesis question now, the second part of the original question
Wonderful.
that you asked
Right. Right.
a moment
Mm-hmm.
ago. Um, I want to frame this as another one of those false dichotomies. So, on the one hand, there are Christians who engage in cultural critique who incessantly and for good reasons, but inadequate reasons that I'll come on to, bang the drum of antithesis. That there's no sort of compromise between the Bible and culture. That there's no, it's not that one bleeds into the other, they are antithetical to each other. And on the other hand, there are some Christians who are predisposed to find always accommodations between the Bible and culture, who sort of come at it with the idea that, well, fundamentally, the Bible and the culture are saying the same thing. We just need to dig down deep enough to find those commonalities, those accommodations between Bible and culture. And what I want to do with that dichotomy is say, well, let's just hold on a minute and let's look at the way in which the Bible itself thinks about the relation between Christianity and culture. And of course, as you very rightly said, that's not going to be given in any one single passage. You need to take the whole of the counsel of God into account when you do that. But I do want to focus on a couple of passages that I think give a really rich response to that question and show how antithesis and accommodation both have their place, but not as the only sort of string to our bow, the only arrow in our quiver. So let's take, for example, 1 Corinthians 1. And this is the passage around which I structure the whole of my Foucault book. I think it's in a very richly productive passage for cultural critique. And what Paul is doing there is much more than simply saying, what I resolved when I was with you was to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. If we reduce 1 Corinthians 1 to that verse and say, well, all we need to do therefore is speak about the cross in terms that are culturally deaf, then I think we do Paul a disservice, because he's doing something a lot richer in this chapter than that. And what he's doing, I think, is brilliantly captured by Tim Keller in a lecture that he gives. I think it's still available on iTunes U. It's a lecture course on, I think, preaching Christ in a postmodern world that he did with Ed Clowney. And in that course, Keller um, breaks down what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 1 into 4 moments. And I won't get his words exactly, but this is the gist of what he says. He says, first of all, Paul identifies the deep values that animate the cultures around him, the Greek culture and the Jewish culture. And he says, Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom. So what you want when you encounter something culturally is, Greeks, you want to become wiser, because that's something that's really important for you. And Jews, you want a manifestation of power. You want a sign that there is power behind this cultural manifestation. And then what he does is he doesn't dismiss those values outright, but neither does he simply endorse and affirm them. He says, and this is Keller's second point, you can't arrive at the fullness of what you're seeking in the way that you're seeking for it. So in other words, Greeks, if you look for wisdom in the way you're looking for it at the moment, you're never going to find true wisdom. And Jews, if you look for power where you're looking for it at the moment, you're always going to be ultimately frustrated. You're never going to find the fullness of power that you seek. And then Keller's third moment is that the reality and the fullness and the depth of what you're looking for is actually to be found in Christ. And this is where Paul says, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. And this is so counterintuitive, both in their day and in ours, because Christ is, for the Jew, the epitome of weakness. Here is a condemned criminal hanging on a cross. How far away could you be from a sign of ultimate power than that? And for the Greek, what is there more unwise, more foolish, more stupid, really, in society than a man who was a criminal hanging on a cross? There's no wisdom there. But Paul says you need a complete transformation of what you understand wisdom to be, and you need a complete transformation of what you understand power to be, because actually Christ's God's wisdom is wiser than men, and actually true wisdom is found in the cross because it's the way to God. And God's weakness, the weakness of the cross, is stronger than men. And what that structure gives us, as Keller brings it into land by saying, so dear Jews and Greeks, this is how you can find true wisdom. This is how you can find true power. You need to come to the cross, the last place you'd ever think of looking for those things. You need to completely transform your understanding of what these things are in order to find them in their fullness. And this schema that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 1, I think it has its moments of antithesis, doesn't it? Paul is saying you are not going to find wisdom and you are not going to find power outside Christ. It's not that sort of Christ meets you halfway. It is that you need to stop what you're doing and you need to come to Christ and you need to find these things in him. So there is an antithetical moment, but there's also a moment of affirmation, because Paul is not saying stop looking for power, and he's not saying stop looking for wisdom. He's saying you're actually not looking for these things well enough. You need to look for them more, and you need to find a better way of finding them. So he's almost transfiguring these cultural values and saying, let's get serious about looking for power. Let's get serious about looking for wisdom. And let's find the fullness of those things in Christ. And the reason that I wanted to walk through 1 Corinthians 1 there was to show that it's not that there's no place for antithesis, and it's not that there's no place for affirmation of cultural values, but it's that these two things find their place within a whole that is irreducibly complex. So you can't just wrench the antithesis out of 1 Corinthians 1 and say that our approach to culture is antithetical. Or you can't wrench affirmation out of 1 Corinthians 1 and say our fundamental approach to culture is to affirm its values. Both of those are heresies. Both of those are reductions of the complexity of Paul's approach. And so it's not that, I don't think we should place ourselves on the spectrum between antithesis and affirmation, or just affirm one of those or the other. I think you need to tell that bigger story. You need to diagonalize that false dichotomy and saying that those things are reductions of a more complex and actually much more satisfying and more dynamic approach to cultural critique that is embodied, for example, in 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul isn't simply antithetical and is not simply affirming Jewish and Greek culture.